There's a barge sitting about 400 yards off a stretch of Florida coastline, and what's piled on the deck of it does not look like conservation. It looks like a mistake. 20-some tons of empty oyster shell, grey, chalky, sun-bleached to the colour of old bone. It's been sitting in an open lot for 3 or 4 months getting cooked, and if you walked past that lot in July, you would have smelled it from the road. A guy in waders gives a hand signal. The hydraulics kick, and the whole load goes over the side at once, this dry, rattling avalanche of shell-hitting saltwater, a sound somewhere between applause and a landslide. It takes maybe 11 seconds. The water goes cloudy, the barge rides higher, and then everybody just stands there, looking at a patch of murky green water where 20 tons of restaurant garbage used to be. If you saw that and thought somebody should be arrested, you would not have been the only one, because on paper, that's ocean dumping. That's a boat deliberately putting solid waste into a public waterway, in a state that will fine you $800 for tossing a cigarette butt off a bridge. Except it wasn't a crime, it was a permit, and it was the single most effective thing anyone had done for that stretch of water in about 60 years. Here's what nobody standing on that barge could see yet. Down there in the dark, drifting in the current, were somewhere around 100 million things waiting for exactly this. Let's get the obvious explanation out of the way first because it's wrong, and the fact that it's wrong is the whole story. If you ask most people why Florida's oysters disappeared, you'll get some version of, we ate them all. Overharvesting. Too many boats, too many tongs, too many dozen on the half-shell specials, until one day the guys went out and the beds were empty. And look, harvest pressure is real, it's genuinely part of this. But if overharvesting were the whole story, then the fix would be simple, right? Stop harvesting. Close the bay, let it sit. Come back in 5 years and the oysters bounce back, the way a fished-out lake refills once you stop pulling walleye out of it. Florida ran that exact experiment, on purpose, at scale. In 2020, the state's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission shut down wild oyster harvest in Apalachicola Bay entirely, followed by a formal 5-year closure. No commercial, no recreational, nothing. This was not a small decision. Apalachicola had historically supplied around 90% of the oysters in Florida and roughly 10% of the oysters eaten in the entire United States. Shutting it down meant shutting down a town. 5 years of total protection, zero harvest pressure, textbook conditions for recovery, and when biologists went out and surveyed the bay partway through that closure, the results were, in the polite institutional phrasing, not as positive as people had hoped, which should stop you. Because that shouldn't happen. You remove the pressure, the population is supposed to come back. That's how fisheries work. Unless the thing you removed wasn't actually what was killing them. Okay, let's back up, because to understand why the closure didn't work, you need to understand what actually happened in Apalachicola. And it's not one villain, it's about 4 of them showing up at once. The bay collapsed in 2012. Just fell over. Landings that had been in the millions of pounds dropped through the floor. By August of 2013, the US Secretary of Commerce had declared a federal fishery disaster. Boats that had been working that bay for 4 generations sat at the dock. The immediate trigger was water, or rather, the lack of it. Apalachicola Bay is fed by the Apalachicola River, which is the tail end of a river system that starts way up in Georgia as the Chattahoochee and the Flint. Metro Atlanta drinks out of that system. Georgia farmers irrigate out of it. A network of dams and reservoirs run by the Army Corps of Engineers decides how much gets released downstream. And in the years leading up to 2012, that system was in drought operations, repeatedly. Less fresh water coming down the river means saltier water in the bay. And here's the thing about oysters. They don't actually like full-strength seawater. They tolerate it. What they love is brackish, that in-between zone, and the reason they love it is not comfort. It's protection. Because the stuff that eats oysters, oyster drills, certain crabs, a parasite called dermo, those things love salt. Brackish water is basically a chemical fence that keeps the predators out. Let the salinity climb, and you've taken the fence down. So the drought didn't kill the oysters directly. It just opened the gate and let everything else in. Florida was furious about it, and in 2013 the governor announced the state was suing Georgia over upstream water use. That case went all the way to the US Supreme Court. In April of 2021, the court ruled against Florida. acknowledging that salinity and predation had played a role in the collapse, but finding that Florida hadn't proven Georgia's water consumption was the cause. So, no water coming, no legal remedy, and the fishery already flat on its back. Now, in fairness to everyone involved, researchers looking at this afterward have been careful to say there's no single confirmed cause of the crash. Part of the problem is that nobody was monitoring the bay closely enough before 2012 to know exactly what changed. You can't identify the murder weapon if you never took a picture of the room. But drought, salinity, predation, and decades of harvest pressure is the working consensus. 4 things at once. And that's still not the part that explains why closing the bay didn't fix it. Around the same time, all this was falling apart, in a completely different part of the state. A handful of people were making a suggestion that got them laughed at. Their pitch was this: go around to seafood restaurants, collect the empty shells off the plates, wash them, let them sit in a parking lot for 3 or 4 months, then load them on a boat and throw them in the ocean. That's it. That's the plan. I want you to imagine being a county commissioner and having someone walk into your office with that. You are being asked to fund a program whose deliverable is garbage relocated. You are being asked to permit the deliberate placement of solid waste into a protected estuary. You are being asked to explain to voters why the county is paying for a truck to move trash from behind a restaurant to the bottom of a bay. The objections weren't stupid either. They were the objections you'd want somebody to raise. Disease was the big one. Shell coming off a restaurant plate might have come from anywhere. A different bay, a different state, potentially a different disease environment. Dump that in your local water and you could import a pathogen into a population that has no resistance to it. That's not a hypothetical fear. That's roughly how oyster fisheries in other parts of the country got wrecked in the 20th century. Then there's the physical problem. Loose shell on a soft bottom sinks. Florida estuary floors are frequently mud and silt and fine sand, and if you dump shell on that, a good portion of it just disappears into the sediment. Gone. You've spent the money and produced nothing. And then there was the biggest objection, the one that isn't scientific at all. It's the one that sounds like common sense and has probably killed more good restoration projects than any permit ever did. If the oysters are gone, throwing dead shells at the problem doesn't bring them back. You need oysters, not shells. That sounds airtight. It's also completely backwards. And to see why, you have to look at what an oyster actually is for the first 2 weeks of its life. Everybody knows what a grown oyster is. It's a rock that's alive. It sits there. It doesn't go anywhere. It has famously no interest in being anywhere else. But that's the second half of its life. An adult oyster spawns by releasing eggs and sperm straight into the water column. A single female can put out numbers in the tens of millions in one season. Fertilization happens out there in open water, and what results is not a tiny oyster. It's a larva, and the larva swims. For roughly 2 to 3 weeks, this thing is plankton. It's drifting, it's feeding, it's getting carried by currents and tides, and it is microscopic. You would need a hand lens to see it as anything other than haze in a water sample. And it's looking for something. Late in that drifting phase, the larva develops a light-sensitive spot. Not an eye in any real sense. It can't see shapes, it can't see you. It can tell light from dark, and it drops out of the water column and starts crawling along the bottom on a little muscular foot, testing surfaces, hunting for one specific thing, something hard. When it finds a hard surface it likes, it does something irreversible. It secretes a cement out of a gland in that foot, glues its left shell down permanently, reabsorbs the foot it will never use again, and becomes a spat. From that second forward, it is fixed in place until it dies. No relocating, no second attempt. One shot. And if it doesn't find a hard surface in time, it dies. That's the whole outcome. Millions of them drifting over soft mud, running out of clock. So, what's the hardest, most attractive, most chemically welcoming surface an oyster larva can find in a Florida estuary? Oyster shell. Specifically, old oyster shell. The larvae respond to it. The mineral surface, the microbial film that grows on it, the sheer roughness of the thing. Rocks work, pilings work, concrete works, but nothing works like the shells of the oysters that came before them, which means oyster reefs are, structurally, an inheritance. Each generation builds directly on the bodies of the last one, cement themselves to their ancestors and add another floor. That's not a metaphor, that is literally the construction method. The reef is the graveyard, and now flip that around. If you take the shell out of the system, you haven't just removed dead material, you've removed the floor, and the next generation can spawn 100 million larvae into perfectly clean, perfectly healthy, perfectly oxygenated water, and every single one of them will die because there's nowhere to land. That's why closing the bay didn't work. You can protect adult oysters all you want, but if there's no shell on the bottom, you are protecting the last generation of a lineage that can no longer reproduce in place. It's not a population problem, it's a real estate problem. So where did all the shell go? We ate it. Sort of. And this is the part that I think genuinely doesn't get said enough, because it reframes the whole thing. Every time somebody harvests an oyster and eats it in a restaurant 100 miles inland, two things leave the estuary. The meat, obviously, but also the shell, a hard, permanent, load-bearing piece of that reef's future structure. And the shell doesn't come back. It goes in a bin, it goes in a truck, it goes in a landfill. And this went on for a very long time. Decades. Every dozen on the half-shell was a very small withdrawal from a very slow-building structure that had taken thousands of years to accumulate. And historically, it was worse than that, because shell wasn't only discarded, it was harvested as a material. Coastal shell deposits around the Gulf were dredged and burned for lime, crushed for road base, ground up for use in feed and cement. In some places, the reef itself was mined. We didn't just eat oysters, we eventually mined the foundation they stood on, and nobody was writing that down as an ecological cost because who counts garbage? The scale of the loss is documented, and it is grim. Peer-reviewed work, the widely cited Beck study from 2011, puts global loss of oyster reefs at around 85% over roughly 2 centuries. In the Gulf of Mexico specifically, depending on the location, somewhere between 50 and 89% gone across about 130 years. Florida's own regulators have described many of the state's estuaries as having lost 80 to 90% of their oyster reefs. Pinellas County on Tampa Bay puts local losses at more than 85% since the 1950s. And more recent work is blunter still. In a lot of locations worldwide, losses have exceeded 95%, to the point where scientists describe those reefs as functionally extinct. Not gone? There are still oysters, just no longer numerous enough to do any of the jobs a reef does. Which brings us to the jobs. An oyster is a pump. It feeds by drawing water across its gills, straining out the algae and the fine suspended particles, and pushing the water back out. Florida's Department of Environmental Protection puts the number at up to 50 gallons of water per adult oyster per day. Other Florida groups quote it around 2.5 gallons an hour, which lands in the same neighborhood. One oyster, 50 gallons, now stack that. A modest restored reef, not a historic one, a modest new one, can hold hundreds of thousands of adult oysters. Do the arithmetic and you're at millions of gallons a day filtered by a structure that nobody built, that nobody powers, that has no maintenance contract, and that gets bigger over time instead of wearing out. Try to buy that. Seriously, try to price a water treatment installation that processes millions of gallons a day, requires no electricity, no staff, no chemical inputs, and appreciates in capacity annually. There is no line item for that. It doesn't exist as a purchasable product. And filtration is only the first job. A reef is also a wall. A 3-dimensional oyster reef is rough, dense, and immovable, and when a wave hits it, that roughness bleeds the energy out of the wave through friction and breaking before it ever reaches the shoreline behind it. Researchers have measured this directly. In one well-known field study, breakwater reef treatments cut shoreline retreat by more than 40% at one of the test sites. Lab work on oyster-covered breakwater structures has found that friction on the oyster surface accounts for the overwhelming majority of the energy dissipation. The rough living surface is doing the work, not just the lump of rock underneath. That's a seawall that repairs itself and that grows upward as sea level rises, and that doesn't have the nasty habit real seawalls have of reflecting wave energy sideways and eating your neighbour's beach. And it's a nursery. Crabs, shrimp, small fish, the whole forage base that redfish and trout and everything else you'd want to catch depends on. They live in the gaps between the shells. Remove the reef and you don't just lose oysters, you lose the structure the fishery is standing on. So here's the ledger. On one side, water filtration, storm protection, erosion control, fish habitat, and a commercial harvest. On the other side, a pile of restaurant shells that a county is currently paying money to bury in the ground. Somebody was eventually going to notice. The program started small and they started weird. One of the earliest in the Florida Panhandle launched in November 2010. The Choctaw-Hatchie Basin Alliance, working with an AmeriCorps team, running a shell recycling program with a name that was clearly built backwards from the acronym Offer Your Shell to Enhance Restoration. Oyster, sure. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection got into it in 2011, partnering with Keep Pensacola Beautiful to collect discarded shell from restaurants around Escambia and Santa Rosa counties, with funding running through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and a local utility. And the actual mechanics of it are almost aggressively unglamorous. A participating restaurant gets a bin, a blue 32-gallon can typically parked out by the dish pit or next to the dumpster. Shuckers scrape the empties into the bin instead of the trash. 2 or 3 times a week, somebody comes and takes it. There's a chef in Houston working with a similar program on the Texas side who described it about as plainly as it can be described. You put a bin by the dish pit, then you move it next to the dumpster. That's the participation. That's the whole ask. His restaurant's recycled 16 tons in a year doing that. Then the shell goes to a curing yard. And this is the step that solves the disease objection, and it's beautifully low-tech. You dump it in the open, and you leave it there, in the sun, for months. Florida's standard practice has the shell baking a minimum of 90 days, raked periodically to turn it. Some county programs go 4 months or longer. Ultraviolet light, heat, and time kill off anything hitching a ride. There's no autoclave, no chemical bath. You just put the problem outside and let the state of Florida in August handle it. Curing yards, if you ever see one, are marked with little signs on each pile. Date it went down, date it comes out. It's the least dramatic sight in conservation. Mountains of chalk with a calendar attached, and then volunteers show up. Because the loose shell sinks problem is real, a lot of programs don't dump loose shell at all. They bag it. Mesh bags, often around 30 pounds each, sometimes made of biodegradable materials specifically so the mesh rots away after the oysters have cemented everything together. And filling those bags is done by hand, by people, on weekends. I want to be honest about what that work is like because there's a version of this story where I make it sound heroic, and it isn't. It's hot. The shell is sharp and it will cut you through cheap gloves. The bags are heavy and awkward, and you carry them across mud that tries to take your boots. The smell is not good. You will be sunburned in unusual places. One organization on the Treasure Coast tallied it up. More than 2,400 volunteers, over 6,000 hours logged, 20 participating restaurants, and the result was somewhere near 60,000 square feet of restored oyster habitat in the St. Lucie Estuary and Indian River Lagoon. 6,000 hours of bagging trash. And here's a detail I find quietly telling. That same program currently has a note up saying it's paused on collecting shell from its restaurant partners. These things run on grant cycles and staff capacity, and they stop and start. Which is its own point. This isn't some unstoppable green machine. It's fragile, volunteer-dependent, and perpetually one budget line from going dark. Now, the deployments themselves. The Coastal Conservation Association's Florida chapter has been running deployments in Charlotte Harbor at a site called Turtle Bay. In May of 2023, they put down an additional 22.5 tons of recycled oyster shell in a single deployment, their third at that site, bringing the running total there to 6 dump truckloads since 2021. Earlier, back in 2017, that same organization donated 5 tons of cured shell for a habitat project in Hernando County's coastal waters, where it got packed into mesh bags and set down to form the base of a reef in Centipede Bay. 22.5 tons, 5 tons, 16 tons a year from one restaurant group. Which brings me to something I have to address, because if you've seen this story bouncing around online recently, you've probably seen a much bigger number. There's a claim circulating right now that Florida dumped over 500,000 tons of recycled shell into the Gulf between 2007 and 2024. I went looking for the source of that. I could not find one. Not in state agency reporting, not in NOAA project documentation, not in the program summaries that researchers have compiled. It appears to have started life in an aggregator article and then been copied outward the way these things do, gathering confidence with every repost. And I'm flagging it rather than just quietly leaving it out for a reason. Look at what the documented programs actually report. A compiled review of shell recycling programs across the Gulf lists the Apalachicola program at roughly £260,000 total, averaging around £65,000 a year from about 9 restaurants. Tampa Bay Watch's program, around £80,000 recycled, working with 7 restaurants. The largest recycling operation in the region, the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana, not even in Florida, was at about £13 million by the end of 2022, roughly £1.4 million a year. £13 million is 6,500 tons, so the honest picture is recycled restaurant shell is measured in the tens of thousands to millions of pounds. It's real, it's growing, and it is nowhere near 500,000 tons. Broader reef restoration efforts do move much larger volumes of material, but that's typically quarried limestone, fossil shell, and concrete, not oysters off a dinner plate, and that's a different program with different economics. Why does this matter? Because inflated numbers are how good stories get killed. Somebody fact-checks the 500,000 tons, finds nothing, and concludes the whole thing was made up. It wasn't. The real version is smaller and, honestly, more interesting, because the real version is a bunch of underfunded county programs and volunteers, with mesh bags getting outcomes that shouldn't be possible at that budget. Which is exactly what happened. Here's what the shell does when it hits bottom. Almost immediately, it starts growing a microbial film, a slick biological coating that develops on hard surfaces in seawater. That film matters because it's part of what larvae are queuing on. A brand new, sterile, clean surface is less attractive than a slightly grubby one. The shell has to get a little dirty before it becomes attractive real estate. And then, in the next spawning window, larvae drifting over that spot find something they haven't found there in decades. They land, they cement, they stop moving forever. And everyone that survives to adulthood adds its own shell to the structure, which means next season there's more surface than there was, which means more settlement, which means more surface. The reef starts compounding. That's the whole mechanism. You're not building a reef, you're restarting one and then getting out of the way while it builds itself. The site becomes three-dimensional. It goes from a flat grey patch to a rough, cratered, complex thing full of gaps, and the gaps fill with crabs and small fish, and the pumps switch on. Millions of gallons a day moving across gills that weren't there a year ago. And the evidence that this is doing something isn't a nice photograph. It's a regulatory decision. Apalachicola Bay's 5-year moratorium on wild harvest expired at the end of December 2025. And on January 1st, 2026, that bay reopened, limited, cautious, tightly leashed, but open. The first commercial season ran January through February, with future seasons planned October through February. Read the rules carefully, though, because the rules are the actual news. Harvest is permitted only on reefs that meet a minimum biological threshold, at least 400 bags of legal-sized oysters per acre. Total take is capped at 10% of standing abundance in open areas to protect the spawning stock. Commercial harvesters need a specific endorsement, and qualifying requires documented prior harvest and sale between 2012 and 2020. For that opening season, approved commercial endorsement holders split a share of somewhere around 4,700 bags. Recreational permit holders got 1 bag. For the season, 1 bag. That is not a fishery roaring back. That is a fishery on a leash, being walked very slowly around the block. But here is the line from the state agency that I keep coming back to, and it's the quiet center of this entire story. The restored reefs are currently the only locations in the bay with enough oyster abundance to support harvest. Not the historic reefs, not the ones that got 5 years of total protection and no restoration. The restored ones, the ones somebody put material on, that's the proof. Protection alone gave you a bay that still couldn't support a harvest. Protection plus substrate gave you the only places in the bay where oysters came back thick enough to touch. Money followed. Florida's budget for the 2025 to 26 fiscal year included $12.5 million for oyster reef restoration in that bay alone, plus additional funds for the district. NOAA has put $5 million into expanding shell recycling programs across the Gulf, and the Pensacola and Perdido Bay's estuary program is administering a separate $10.9 million award to design a bay-scale oyster restoration initiative covering nearly 1,500 acres, aiming to construct up to 247 of them within 4 years. And the economics, when researchers have run them, are almost rude. Analysis cited in the restoration literature has found that the benefits of building an oyster reef can outweigh the cost of establishing it within roughly 2 to 14 years, depending on the site. And unlike a seawall, the asset doesn't depreciate. It grows. A concrete bulkhead is worth less every year from the day you pour it. A reef is worth more. Meanwhile, Louisiana went and did the most Louisiana thing possible about it. Passed legislation giving restaurants a tax credit for recycling their shell. $1 per 50 pounds, capped at £2,000 a year, effective January 2024. Small money, but it turns the shell on the plate from a disposal cost into an asset. And once something is an asset, people stop throwing it away without being asked. So let me put the honest version of this on the table because I don't want to hand you a fairy tale. Shell recycling is not a solution to coastal erosion. It's not a solution to sea level rise. It's not going to fix the Apalachicola, because the Apalachicola's core problem is a water allocation fight that the Supreme Court has already declined to fix. Restoration can't manufacture fresh water. If the salinity stays wrong, the reefs you build will eventually get eaten by the same things that ate the last ones. Restored reefs also fail, regularly. Wrong site, wrong depth, wrong bottom. A hurricane at the wrong moment, and your 20 tons of shell is a 20-ton lump of nothing. The published record on wave attenuation is genuinely all over the place from site to site. Some reefs bleed off serious wave energy, others barely register. Anyone selling you a clean success rate is selling you something, and the programs themselves are held together with grant funding and weekend volunteers and one staff member who is very tired. But strip all that away and something stubborn is left. A thing that got thrown out for 60 years at enormous cumulative volume turned out to be the exact missing input. Not a substitute for the missing input, the actual thing. The bottleneck was never oysters, and it was never even really water quality. It was floor space, and the floor space was in a dumpster behind a restaurant the entire time. I keep chewing on what that implies, because if the limiting factor for an entire coastal ecosystem was a waste product we were paying to bury, then the obvious question is, what else is on that list? What other collapse system is failing for want of some material we currently classify as garbage, purely because nobody thought to ask? And there's a number nobody has yet, which is the one I actually want. Florida has something like 8,000 miles of tidal shoreline. Every year, Floridians and tourists eat an enormous quantity of oysters, and the vast majority of those shells still go into the ground because most restaurants in the state aren't part of any recycling program. So, if every one of those shells went back into the water instead of into a landfill, how much coastline could that hold together? How many miles of shoreline could quietly stop retreating? Nobody's run that number. Which is a strange thing to be able to say about a state that has spent decades paying to bury the answer. If you want more of these, the ones where the boring, unglamorous, slightly gross detail turns out to be the whole hinge of the story, subscribe. There's a lot more of this out there than you'd think.